to make him provoke a war between races. Since it had already been exposed by the protagonist, Newt had no reason to continue pretending. Just as he let down his guard, a figure suddenly sprang out from behind him. The person was none other than Brian. He cast spells while arrogantly looking down at the protagonist. Under the influence of the gravity magic array, the protagonist and Newt were forced to kneel on the ground. Coupled with the previous probing, the protagonist realized that this person's magical energy was related to force. After Brian saw the protagonist trapped in his magic array, he became increasingly arrogant. He even continued to apply pressure, preparing to crush them into a meat paste. Then, he stepped closer to Newt, ready to deal with him first. Unbeknownst to him, Newt had already prepared the amplifying potion in his hand. He was just waiting for the moment he approached. When he raised his fist, confidently announcing his victory speech, Newt suddenly drank the amplifying potion in his hand. Then, under the influence of the potion, his strength surged significantly. He floated in the air with an unstoppable demeanor. Yet even so, Brian remained calm and composed. Meanwhile, the significantly strengthened Newt launched an attack on him. Facing the descending attack, Brian deployed a defensive stance, wrapping himself up. Following a loud crash, his barrier was shattered and smoke billowed up. Seeing this situation, the weakened Newt thought he had successfully dealt with him. Unexpectedly, a fist the size of a large pot suddenly erupted from the smoke. It struck Newt's abdomen solidly. Blood involuntarily spurted from his mouth. Just as he was about to fall elegantly to the ground, Brian grabbed his hair. With his other hand, he cast a spell again, adding another magic enhancement to it. Another punch landed heavily on Newt's face. The gushing blood splattered onto Brian's face as well. What bad luck. I got dirtied by the filth. You beast tribes are the same as demon tribes. Both are trash-like races. Upon hearing this, the protagonist stood motionless not far away. With an expressionless face, he stared at the leftover potion on the ground. In this state, the protagonist clearly felt that he had reached the peak of his anger. Not only that, he was also prepared to secretly deal with Alice during this practical lesson. Hearing this, Newt rushed at him like a gust of wind. But his weakened body could not stop Brian's actions at all. He could only tightly lock him in place without releasing his grip. To this end, Brian prepared to cast the triple position overlay to send Newt on his way. Just as he was about to strike down, a mysterious force extinguished his hand. The pain made Brian scream. A faint flame could still be seen at the wound. It was simply too little. This little bit left is barely enough to recover 1% of my former state. Hearing this, both of them turned to the source of the voice. At this moment, the protagonist once again entered the half-demon form. Yet despite this, Brian did not back down. He arrogantly said, "Just because of a successful sneak attack, you're so arrogant. You can't seriously think you can kill me, a second-year student of the academy, can you?" The protagonist did not answer his question. Instead, he commanded him to apologize to Newt. "We'll settle the rest later." As soon as these words were spoken, Brian was filled with humiliation and anger. He cursed and said, "Are you kidding me? You want me to apologize to trash?" Regarding Brian's response, the protagonist was very displeased. His anger was reignited once more. Seeing that the situation was dire, Brian had no choice but to strike first. He preemptively cast his ultimate finishing move. The magic circle behind him continued to overlap. It stopped only when the 12th layer appeared. Then, with a loud bang, Brian summoned a retro giant behind him. Looking at the divine-like spirit before him, Newt fell into despair once again. Because for the first-year protagonist, this was simply unwinnable. It was a blow from entirely different dimensions. Whether in terms of strength or size, Brian had an absolute advantage. Arrogantly, he did not forget to mock the protagonist. He believed the protagonist would never reach his current height in a lifetime. After saying this, he threw a stylish punch, preparing to end this farce. At that moment, his fist was hurtling towards the protagonist at a speed of 200 kilometers per second. Yet the protagonist merely raised his small hand, effortlessly blocking Brian's proud attack. Until he saw this scene, he finally understood the protagonist's strength. However, this was not over yet, because Brian still had a backup plan. Just then, at the point where the protagonist was touching the demon spirit, a dark energy was gradually eroding the protagonist. Seeing this, Newt next to him grew worried about the protagonist's safety. Meanwhile, the protagonist remained calm as the demon spirit encroached upon him. He did not take any countermeasures, because in his eyes, the best way to deal with the demon spirit was to be the demon spirit. Upon hearing this, Brian laughed at the protagonist's ignorance once more. He believed that with the protagonist's current strength, he simply could not summon a demon spirit. Moreover, the protagonist was about to be completely eroded. In the blink of an eye, the demonic energy had infiltrated his entire body. Yet the protagonist remained unmoved. Just as they were about to eliminate the protagonist, Brian then recalled his childhood, the fear dominated by his father. At that moment, the protagonist was tightly encased, and only then did he begin to act. An invisible pressure surged towards Brian. To his surprise, he began to feel fear. Then, the demonic energy around the protagonist gradually faded away. Instead, it began to erode Brian's magic spirit. It was at this moment that Brian sensed something was wrong. Unfortunately, it was already too late. His magic spirit was no longer under his control. Meanwhile, the protagonist's magic spirit, upon a command, displayed his cool demeanor. 3 jet-black giant serpents emerged from the protagonist's body. They then lunged at the giant in front of them. It was as simple as crushing a building. After dealing with the giant, the 3-headed serpent began to merge and transform. Ultimately, it transformed into the appearance of Brian's father, and it wielded a whip, ready to strike him. Scared, Brian burst into tears and his nose began to run. The protagonist had only regained 1% of his power. He defeated the antagonist, making him roll on the ground in distress. He knelt on the spot, calling for mercy. If it weren't for Nude stepping in to stop him, he would have probably been blown to pieces by the protagonist. After all, using personal punishment here could lead to the consequence of being expelled. However, Brian didn't seem to have given up on the idea of taking down the protagonist. He struggled to stand up from the ground. A magic spell attached itself to his hand once more. He then swung his arm to attack the protagonist. Faced with his attack, the protagonist simply waved his hand. Brian's clothes exploded instantly. A powerful force knocked him back several meters. Noe not only lost his left hand, but he also lost half of his hair. At this moment, Newt didn't forget to run over. He mocked him for his diminutive stature. After dealing with Brian, the protagonist came up behind Newt. He suddenly pushed him down. He pinned him down forcefully. This move caught Newt off guard. He hurriedly asked the protagonist what was going on, but the protagonist did not respond to him. He merely wore a pained expression. Seeing Newt, he asked if there was anything he could do to help. Yet the protagonist still remained silent. She just slowly approached him. Then she grabbed his hair. After that, she pried at his mouth. Finally, she gave him a few slaps. But no matter what the protagonist did, he could not trigger the dual cultivation technique within him. Now the external magic power was becoming increasingly uncontrollable. Newt also noticed something was wrong. She sensed that the protagonist was in great pain. In order to help the protagonist, Newt actually offered her own body willingly. Upon seeing this, the protagonist immediately had a nosebleed. He almost lost his life. Seeing that this wouldn't work, the protagonist had no choice but to seek help from Alice alone. But before he could finish speaking, he sensed a powerful magic force approaching him. And this person was emanating the strength of Alice's brother. Upon seeing the fallen Brian, he spoke with a blank expression. The scene was truly pitiful. It was indeed quite dirty. Upon hearing this, Brian immediately got up, knelt on the ground, and began to beg for mercy. What else could Adoni do but kneel halfway on the ground, saying that you don't need to thank me. I know you've already tried your best. However, Secretary Teresa reported to me that you seem to have threatened the enemy with my sister's safety. Since this has happened, have you thought about the consequences? Brian intended to make excuses, but before he could speak, he was instantly sealed in midair by the iced pillar of the tree. Newt and the protagonist were both shocked by this scene. When did he use magic just now? The protagonist didn't notice at all, and the magic power within him grew increasingly restless. It seems this demon will soon be consumed by his own magic power. What a pity. It's rare to find a demon that can stimulate magic power. Newt, if you leave now, I can overlook the fact that you approached Alice as a spy for the Beast Clan. I can let it go. I thought Newt would accept this suggestion. To my surprise, she rejected it for the sake of the protagonist. As soon as these words were spoken, the dual cultivation technique within the protagonist was unexpectedly stirred. A long time ago, Newt was received by the higher UPS of the Beast Clan. Later, he was even arranged to be close to Alice, to monitor her every move. They have been good friends since childhood. After a series of interactions, Newt began to feel confused. He did not understand why the war between races would involve Alice. He wasn't wrong. The mistake lies in the power struggle among the higher UPS of the races. In order to prevent Alice from being sad, he made a bold decision. At that moment, a whirlwind suddenly arose around Newt, sweeping up the dust and sand from the ground, temporarily blocking Adonis's line of sight, preventing him from acting for a moment. Taking advantage of this brief time, Newt forcefully threw the protagonist out. Even the protagonist was a bit stunned. It was unexpected for him. Before parting, Newt shed tears of regret, and asked the protagonist to apologize to Alice for him. When the smoke cleared, he was about to face the toughest opponent he had ever encountered. Just as he was about to make a move, to his surprise, the protagonist reappeared in the same spot. The escape opportunity that had finally been created for him was wasted by the protagonist just like that. However, the protagonist had already thought of a solution, and it would only take 3 steps to win. But no matter how he explained, Newt simply didn't believe the protagonist's nonsense. And after hearing this, Adonis, she showed a look of disdain. Then, the ice pillar instantly enveloped the protagonist, and it continued to expand, facing his sudden ice magic. The protagonist had already thought of a countermeasure, but it didn't last long. He was interrupted by the raging magic within him. Even his left arm was nearly eroded by the magic. If this continued, he would eventually be completely consumed. And Adonis realized this as well. The ice pillar behind him was also poised to strike. In the blink of an eye, the magic array appeared above the protagonist. Seeing this situation, the protagonist could only continue to cast spells to resist. Watching the protagonist being consumed bit by bit, Newt tried to stop him from continuing, but the protagonist knew that if he came instead, he would be unable to withstand this fierce attack at all. But even so, he still wanted to exchange his life for the protagonist's life, because in his heart, he had already betrayed Alice, so he couldn't let him lose the person he loved. At that moment, the moment of activating the dual cultivation technique constantly surfaced in the protagonist's mind. They both had a common trait. That is, the desire deep within each other's hearts. Newt actually wants to survive too, to apologize to Alice, to become true friends with him. The moment he voiced his wish, the protagonist confidently steadied himself. A powerful force burst forth. It completely nullified Adonis's magic. The protagonist also returned to normal, holding the sleeping Newt in his arms. Adonis, seeing this scene, also understood that the protagonist had just used the dual cultivation technique. This was a magic created by his grandmother. It is a technique that requires magicians of different genders to combine in order to use it. But even if this technique exists, he still showed no fear. Yet the protagonist had no intention of confronting him. He merely stated he would win in one move. After saying that, the protagonist opened his hand with one finger. He said to Adonis, "Get ready to catch." Then a green light slowly emerged. The scene made Adonis extremely anxious. Who would have thought the protagonist was just feigning a move? Taking advantage of his distraction, he turned and jumped into the teleportation portal. This action left Adonis stunned. It even made him start to question his life. Meanwhile, the nearby Tereshak could only slowly guide him. As for the protagonist, he appeared in a heroic fashion, as if to save a damsel in distress. In the eyes of the public, the anxious waiting of the Rikit sword rushed over to ask about the protagonist's condition, because just a moment ago, two astounding waves of magic suddenly erupted in the forest. It scared them all, until they came back to their senses. They finally realized that Newt was held in the protagonist's arms. This scene left him utterly stunned. Meanwhile, the newly awakened Newt recalled the moment when the protagonist kissed him before. His face flushed and his heart raced. Embarrassed, he jumped down from the protagonist's arms. In just a few short hours, his boss had already captured Newt. At this moment, the protagonist and Rikit, the psychological status of the little brothers was elevated once again. Just as they were goofing around, a voice suddenly came from behind, and the source of the voice was none other than Alice. At this moment, she was angrily approaching Newt. The little brothers immediately hid behind the protagonist, like swords, afraid that Alice would take them to task. Newt instinctively avoided Alice as well. He didn't dare to face her directly, but she wasn't blaming Newt. Instead, she was worried about her safety. In that moment, Newt's inner unease instantly vanished. Then she hugged Alice and said through tears, "I'm fine, you don't have to worry." But this beautiful moment was shattered by the sudden appearance of Adonis. Without saying a word, she walked straight up to Alice. Faced with her brother's appearance, Alice showed a frightened expression. At that moment, Adonis's charm control limit didn't even know what to say. If it weren't for Teresa's reminder behind him, this state might have continued indefinitely. Adonis, coming back to his senses, first adjusted his state, and then spoke seriously. This demon youth is none other than the demon Lord Belmont, who was sealed for 1,000 years. As soon as he said this, those who knew the protagonist felt incredulous. They never expected that this boy, who died at a young age, was actually the lord of the demon race. But even so, Alice still couldn't believe this fact. She questioned her brother. Wasn't Belmont sealed by Arya's grandmother? Was he not turned into a statue? Hearing her doubts, Teresa, standing not far away, explained. Not long ago, the statue had already shattered. There is a possibility of weathering, but it's more likely that the demon lord has broken the seal and awakened again. After speaking, a portal appeared behind Adonis. At that moment, a person walked out from inside. The moment he saw that person, Adonis once again pointed out the fact that the protagonist was the demon lord. But unexpectedly, Ohm denied his statement on the spot, stating that the protagonist is not the demon lord. Once these words were spoken, Adonis was immediately puzzled. His previous words instantly backfired. Then Ohm explained. The demon lord that night was a muscular, 2-meter tall man radiating with a sheen of oil. Not this kind of kid. He not only changed his previous testimony entirely, but also swore that he could never be defeated by such a little brat. Yet even so, Adonis still refused to let go of the protagonist, questioning him on how he learned the dual cultivation technique. The protagonist didn't even think about it. The protagonist then explained. Many spells can be passed through bloodlines. Once these words were spoken, it immediately made Alice start to doubt if it was really what she had taught. Seeing Adonis downcast, he can no longer resist the protagonist. Teresa had no choice but to take him back to the student council. Before leaving, she didn't forget to leave a sharp remark. And so the farce ended without resolution. The protagonist also did not reveal his identity. Watching Ohm's receding figure, the protagonist thought this person was Lacey in disguise. Unexpectedly, Lacey suddenly appeared behind her, and she was wearing a full janitor's uniform. This gave her the chance to blend in. Her appearance left the protagonist somewhat puzzled. She did not disguise herself as Ohm. So who is the Ohm just now in disguise? This question made the protagonist involuntarily look again in the direction she left. He then saw the person disguised as Ohm raise a finger, signaling the protagonist not to make a fuss. In the blink of an eye, a week had already passed since the lecture ended. The protagonist returned to his normal class schedule, but during this time, she analyzed the conditions for the dual cultivation technique, while pondering who the person disguised as Ohm really was. If she didn't figure it out, her position would be very unstable. While the protagonist was deep in thought, the teacher suddenly approached the protagonist. Because every class, the protagonist was surrounded by several burly men, which made it difficult for the teacher to focus on teaching. This made it even harder for the protagonist to connect with women. If this continued, she might never interact with the opposite sex. Seeing the protagonist sigh repeatedly, Lacey asked him, "Big brother, you have clearly attained supreme status. So why are you still unhappy?" To everyone's surprise, the protagonist replied that it was far from enough. This terrified his followers. At that moment, Lacey speculated again about the protagonist's thoughts. We are too narrow-minded. She realized that his goal was to dominate the academy. She then handed the protagonist a new student club recruitment notice, preparing to let him start from here. The scene shifted. The club recruitment at the Hero Academy officially began. There were all kinds of clubs available, which were simply tailor-made activities for the protagonist. Moreover, joining the club has its advantages. That is, it can quickly elevate your rank. However, there is a prerequisite. That is to obtain 3 hero medals within the club. This badge represents a hero's strength and status. It is also a symbol of honor. There are 3 ways to obtain it. National recognition, school recognition and recognition from seniors. After saying this, the male protagonist stood in place, trembling slightly. He then turned to Lee Jitae and expressed his heartfelt thanks. Because of the Academy's club activities, it is a place open to both genders. But just as the male protagonist stepped forward, the female students of the Academy immediately stepped back. Now the male protagonist's fame has spread throughout the Academy. It can be said that no one is unaware of him. This is just great. The beautiful life he just imagined shattered in an instant. At this moment, several figures suddenly appeared behind Lee Jitae. They were members of the Enhanced Body Wrestling Club. They wanted to invite the male protagonist to join their club, to better showcase their strong muscles. They immediately performed a show of strength. As a result, the male protagonist didn't even glance at them. He turned and left it to Lee Jitae to handle. His little brothers desperately tried to block the muscle-bound men. Meanwhile, the male protagonist sprinted away from this hell on earth. During this time, he occasionally looked back, afraid that those muscular men would come after them again. Little did they know, in a moment of distraction, a figure unexpectedly appeared in front of the protagonist. Because there was no time to break, the outcome was predictable. The two of them crashed solidly into each other. Furthermore, the protagonist ended up pinning this person down. This scene was indeed the opening of a romance story. To express his apologies, the protagonist took the initiative to say sorry first. However, when he clearly saw the other person's appearance, the protagonist suddenly lost his composure. He even felt that this person was somewhat special, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what made them special. The other person also realized this. Flustered, they expressed, "You must be the new demon boy enrolled here, right? I've heard so much about you." Then, they introduced themselves to the protagonist. An empty infrastructure club. Their actions also surprised the protagonist a bit, because there was actually someone who didn't reject the existence of demons. Faced with the protagonist's doubts, he stated that he would not reject you just because you are a demon. "I will exclude you. Someone once told me that all races should coexist harmoniously." But he hadn't finished his words when the onlookers interrupted him, mocking him for associating with demons. Before they could clarify, Felix displayed the blue-black wings on his back. It turned out he was a half-blood angel, who was also not welcomed here. Although he came from a lowly background, he did not give up because of it, and continued his training at the academy. He only felt regret for the invitation he had just extended to the protagonist. After all, he was the only one in the infrastructure society, but he never expected that the protagonist would actually accept his invitation. The reason the protagonist joined his club was that no one dared to take him. If he went back, he would probably be targeted by the physical enhancement equipment again. Upon learning that the protagonist agreed to join the club, Felix was overjoyed, and immediately invited the protagonist to start the induction test. Meanwhile, Alice and Nude also arrived at the club's recruitment meeting, but they hadn't walked far when they saw the protagonist confronting Felix. The requirements for joining the infrastructure society were quite simple. As long as he can take 3 hits from Felix. Such a small request. The protagonist doesn't take it seriously at all. He readily agreed. After knowing the protagonist was ready, Felix was still smiling just a moment ago, but the next second he became serious. A sharp thrust came at the protagonist. Sensing the imminent danger, the protagonist's true eye activated instantly, and Felix's fierce strike raised a cloud of smoke around them. The protagonist was also knocked back several meters. If it weren't for the true eye reacting instantly, that strike might have injured the protagonist. Not only that, that blow left a huge mark on the ground. At that moment, Alice suddenly spoke up beside them, telling the protagonist to quickly give up this test. The reason Felix's club only has 1 member is because when he gets serious, he becomes a ruthless person who doesn't recognize anyone. Moreover, he is the successor of the swordsmanship of the hero Arya. In Alice's view, the protagonist can't withstand even 3 of his strikes. This also reminded the protagonist of that day 50 years ago. At that time, he was still the mighty demon lord, and the hero Arya also challenged him to a duel with her sword that day. Now his swordsmanship has reappeared. The protagonist naturally hasn't forgotten, but seeing the protagonist remain indifferent, Alice said somewhat impatiently, "Big pervert. If you understand, hurry down." At that moment, Felix also realized he was being too serious. He prepared to end the test with disappointment. Who would have thought the protagonist not only didn't withdraw, but also requested him to start the second round of competition? This made Alice instantly go crazy with anger. If it weren't for Newt holding her back, she would have probably run up to hit the protagonist. After the farce, the protagonist recalled just dodging Felix's sword. Upon hearing this, Alice thought his involvement in the base construction had another purpose. Who would have thought the protagonist would say in front of everyone, "I wonder most precious thing." Felix's face instantly turned red, and his heart raced. Once these words were spoken, meanwhile, Alice cursed the protagonist for being shameless. Although the request is a bit excessive, Felix still agreed to the protagonist. To get the answer he wanted, the protagonist immediately activated his true eye and got ready. It's better not to look. Once he looked, the protagonist discovered something extraordinary. His magic power had actually fused with the sword. This must be a level achieved through extreme training. After learning this, the protagonist gripped his sword tightly again. Meanwhile, Felix was also ready to attack. At the moment he launched his attack, the floor cracked as well. The protagonist followed the trajectory of the magic power to formulate a corresponding countermeasure. He successfully blocked the incoming strike. The powerful airflow then dispersed. As the smoke cleared, the protagonist realized that he had only blocked the sword energy formed by magic, while the real killing blow had already arrived behind him. Fortunately, the protagonist was agile. He immediately reacted and blocked the strike. Finally, the second move was also successfully received by the protagonist. This is also a unique skill of the protagonist's magic spirit. Long ago, The angelic tribe became famous for their powerful swordsmanship, valuing pure bloodlines above all. Mixed bloods would grow ominous black wings. Felix's mother gave birth to him as a half-blood because she traveled the world. She had a child with a foreign father, making him a half-blood. He was rejected by his peers since childhood. He endured inhumane treatment. Until the appearance of the hero, Arya. That changed his situation. Arya not only did not disdain him for being a half-blood angel, but personally taught him swordsmanship. She told him that when blades cross, there is no distinction between noble and lowly. That moment's feeling was unforgettable for him for a lifetime. Arya's sword told him that all races are equal. After understanding Felix's childhood experiences and Arya's thoughts, the protagonist was deeply moved. Felix also decided not to stay behind any longer. Golden wings slowly unfolded behind him. Alice, the descendant of the hero, felt something was off about the sword's stance. She immediately sensed something was wrong. She tried to step forward to stop the test, but the protagonist had no intention of giving up, because he knew this move was called Wings of Light. As he prepared to strike, Felix kindly reminded the protagonist of the power of this move. Upon learning this, the protagonist resolved to defend with all his might. The third move, Wings of Light, was not only Arya's signature technique. This is also Felix's strongest killing move. As long as he takes this hit, the protagonist can smoothly join the club and accomplish his grand ambitions for the future. At that moment, countless lightsabers materialized around the protagonist. Only by finding the true starting sword among them can he break this move. When Felix approached him, the protagonist remained unfazed. Even as Felix easily knocked the sword from his hand, he still did not react. And this was exactly the outcome the protagonist wanted. He deliberately revealed a flaw to Felix to draw him close. At the moment he knocked away the sword, the protagonist sidestepped behind him. Immediately after, there was a loud explosion. A tremendous blast echoed throughout the academy. The violent shock sent smoke billowing across the battlefield, making it impossible to see the situation, until the smoke cleared, revealing the protagonist pinning Felix down. He had achieved victory. Felix appeared somewhat puzzled, wondering why the protagonist knew the flaw in his starting move. When asked this question, the protagonist first helped him up. Then he explained, because you were too focused on the sword. In fact, what truly matters isn't the sword. It's the person wielding the sword. There are more than just blades that can intersect. The protagonist's words made Felix think of his master, and he finally found the person he was looking for. He happily welcomed the protagonist to join the fencing club. As soon as those words were spoken, the protagonist's little thoughts immediately showed. He couldn't wait to implement their previous agreement. This made Felix feel quite embarrassed. Seeing him procrastinate like this, the protagonist wanted to go for it and kiss him, but he was interrupted by Alice standing nearby, and she referred to Felix as senior. Upon hearing this, the protagonist immediately stopped. He recalled what she had said to him before, because it can be hard to distinguish between male and female in the Angel clan, so sometimes he would make mistakes too. To confirm Felix's gender, the protagonist activated the true eye to look at him. The result was predictable. The other person really was his senior. In that moment of realization, the protagonist entered a state of conspiracy. For several days in a row, the protagonist was listless in class. Ever since the club meeting returned, the younger members tried everything they could, but still couldn't lift the protagonist's spirits. It wasn't until Alice's appearance that the protagonist saw a glimmer of hope. This was a desire to emerge from darkness, a body yearning for the light. Moreover, Alice also brought Newt with her. The protagonist's desire for the opposite sex was elevated once again. It could even be said to have reached its peak. But what he never expected was that senior Felix had also come. The hope that had finally emerged was instantly cruelly dashed. And Felix was here this time to fulfill a previous agreement. Then he presented a golden badge with both hands. This was precisely the hero's badge that Rakite had mentioned earlier. It was also the most valuable item of the infrastructure club. Seeing that the protagonist had received a hero's badge just after enrolling, Alice beside him felt a bit jealous. To prove her own strength, she joined the infrastructure club right in front of the protagonist. But the protagonist was competing to see who could gather 3 badges first. Unexpectedly, Newt began to undermine him. Clearly, they could compete even if they weren't in the same club. Yeth insisted on joining the infrastructure club, and he insisted on dragging me in as well. Alice superficially denied what Newt said, but her true intention was to be in the same class as the protagonist in the second year. Hearing this, the protagonist was taken aback for a moment. He didn't quite understand her meaning. Just as he was about to ask for clarification, Alice shyly turned and walked away. At this moment, Rykit explained for her. Because the number of people who can level up is too few, the Hero Academy no longer separates classes by gender after the second year. Hearing this, the protagonist immediately perked up, and he asked Rykit to tell him the details. First, the Hero Festival is a celebration event held by the Academy. To participate, one must obtain permission from all the teachers of the current grade. He then confidently declared that he would take care of the permits. However, the next day, the notification came down. Only his was approved while the protagonist was not. Even using family power was in vain. This left Rykit feeling deeply ashamed. To understand the reason for the rejection, the protagonist personally went to see the teacher who denied him, Aphrodite's office. However, this Aphrodite is not to be trifled with. He is from the infamous Berserker clan. During the war, he achieved great feats through his frenzied bloodline, but they hadn't even entered yet when they heard a commotion coming from the office. To understand what was happening inside, the protagonist was about to reach out to open the door, when suddenly, the office door was flung open. Just by coincidence, the protagonist's hand happened to be on the sensitive part of the leading teacher. Beside them, Rikite stood shivering in place, while the protagonist explained, "This is a coincidence. I was just trying to knock on the door." At that moment, Aphrodite snapped back to reality. Then,
Her face
a loud
flushed
explosion
instantly,
erupted
and her heart
from inside
raced.
the office. Not only that, he even reported to the dean who was already present, accusing the protagonist of various misdeeds. Yet his own actions were frightening as well. He blew up half the office to prove his innocence. The protagonist said with righteous indignation, that behavior was indeed a coincidence. Moreover, for demons, we sometimes need to judge by size. As a result, the protagonist's statements only worsened his situation. He even gave them a handle to hold against him. If Rikite hadn't quickly covered the protagonist's mouth, he might have even blurted out how many he touched. Then he whispered to the protagonist, in the eyes of the Academy's faculty and students, his full name is Klein, the emotionless berserker, the last iron touch woman of the magical world, a person who tolerates public displays of affection, a cruel abuser, Aphrodite. Yet even when they lowered their voices, he still heard them. He even specifically warned Li Ji to mind his own business. After hearing their conversation, the dean intended to say a good word for the protagonist, but was interrupted by Aphrodite. He demanded that the protagonist be taken to the admonition room, so he could personally teach him a lesson. Upon hearing, admonition room, Li Ji immediately thought of the consequences of going in. He intended to warn the protagonist, but to his surprise, the dean actually agreed to his request, allowing him to teach the protagonist a good lesson. The scene changes, and this pitch-black place is the Academy's admonition room. It is filled with various implements, all of which are instruments of torment. Meanwhile, the protagonist is tied up securely in a chair, and the teacher with a whip, slowly getting a bit closer to the male lead. Confess for leniency, resist for severity. Belmont, please tell the teacher your crimes. Upon being asked this, the protagonist felt a bit confused, as he couldn't recall having committed any crimes at all. Later, to better understand the situation, the teacher listed all his misdeeds one by one, looking at the protagonist with anticipation, and demanded him to clarify the details of his intimate contact with girls. As soon as these words were spoken, it completely left the protagonist at a loss. Isn't the teacher a celibate berserker? Why is he so curious about his dual cultivation experience? Although he didn't know why the teacher was like this, the protagonist still insisted that he had not committed any crime, because he was worried about the protagonist's safety. Lickett sneakily followed to the door of the reprimand room to eavesdrop, and the protagonist's words successfully angered the teacher. He swung the whip towards the protagonist. A magical whip attack hit him solidly in the chest. However, the protagonist did not feel pain from this strike, only a strange sensation. The teacher thought the protagonist was scared upon seeing this, so he was urged to quickly explain the crime process. Unexpectedly, the protagonist not only failed to explain, but also requested the teacher to continue whipping him. As soon as this was said, it caught the teacher off guard. He had underestimated the protagonist too much. During the following time, the teacher kept whipping the protagonist. Meanwhile, Lickett was eavesdropping outside the door. With each whip, the protagonist would activate the true eye to observe the flow of the teacher's magic power. This also led the protagonist to discover a clue. The seemingly cold and unfeeling teacher actually hid a passionate heart inside, and the red magic power on the whip was precisely the desire he had been suppressing. As a berserker with the bloodlust boundary, the teacher had to constantly restrain himself, so he could only satisfy his suppressed heart through peeping, to fulfill his repressed desires. Now the protagonist finally understood everything. He also thought of a way to take down the teacher. As the protagonist activated his magic power, the whip in the teacher's hand suddenly acted on its own and lunged at him. The result was predictable. He was tripped by the whip, and ended up getting tied up. As the whip grew tighter, the teacher's expression became increasingly indescribable. These postures were all things the protagonist had read about in books. Indeed, reading more books is definitely right. In the next 20 minutes, the sound of wailing echoed in the training room. Unable to bear it, Lickett finally broke in through the door. He was ready to end this unbearable training. Little did he know, just as he entered, he saw the teacher collapsed on the floor, while the protagonist sat unscathed in a chair. In his eyes now, the protagonist's status was elevated once again. After all, he was a man who could even tame the teacher. And the teacher, to avoid embarrassment in front of the students, had no choice but to say the training was over, and agreed for the protagonist to participate in the Hero Festival. This result delighted Lickett to no end. Those who didn't know might think he had advanced. However, the protagonist couldn't feel happy, because the teacher's attitude was somewhat unusual. This left him puzzled. In fact, the reason the teacher agreed for him to participate in the Hero Festival was because he wanted to truly punish the protagonist at the festival, to really discipline the protagonist. Once this matter was over, Lickett was giving the protagonist a rundown on the related matters of the Hero Festival, but the protagonist wasn't paying any attention at all. He was completely focused on the content of the book in his hands. Meanwhile, on the other side, a man in black was meeting with Ohm. From their conversation, they planned to take action against the protagonist at the Hero Festival. The person impersonating Ohm slowly began to transform back to their original form, and she was the one competing for the protagonist at the start of the semester. Another elf girl, Rostana. In the blink of an eye, they arrived on the day of the Hero Festival. The protagonist excitedly shook his body, because this competition allowed him to see the most girls he had ever seen. As he counted the number of people, he reminisced about his dual cultivation technique. Finally had a place to put it to use. In Lickett's eyes, this operation was seen as documenting powerful opponents. Then, under the impassioned speech of the dean, the Hero Festival officially began. Next was the time for free team formation. The protagonist originally wanted to find a few opposite-gender teammates. He barely took a few steps when he bumped into a muscular, burly man. To express his apologies, they proactively invited the protagonist to join. Before the protagonist could refuse, they quickly pulled the protagonist into their embrace. If it weren't for Newt's intervention, the protagonist might have had to join them. After all, at the festival, the hero's descendants have priority selection rights. Then Newt pulled the protagonist into the whirlwind and said, "How about this? Not only did I save your life, I also get to choose to team up with you first." But before he could finish his words, he was interrupted by Alice beside him. "This is the hero festival. It's a sacred occasion. I advise you to be more serious." Unexpectedly, Newt did not take her hint. He even told her to hurry and choose her teammates. Upon hearing this, Alice became anxious immediately, because she also wanted to team up with the protagonist, but she was too shy to say it. In the end, it was still Newt who broke the awkward situation, which allowed Alice to join the team. With that, they had gathered 3 people, but they still needed one more to enter the hero festival. At that moment, Rostana suddenly appeared, expressing her desire to team up with the protagonist. But Alice was very resistant to her joining. The protagonist's focus is on the other person's gender, because he had suffered a loss once. So this time, the protagonist is particularly cautious. In response to the protagonist's question, Rostana generously answers that she is a girl. After learning this, the protagonist decisively agrees to her joining. Only the protagonist's little brother, Rykit, is unwanted. He can only be forcibly taken away by the muscular men of the gym. During this time, they also threaten to reshape her body properly, to make her no longer so weak. The scene shifts. The protagonist team, now organized, arrives at the Dragon's Cave dungeon. Here, there are 4 separate passages. Each person needs to choose a passage to challenge. Among them, the bas-reliefs on the walls caught the protagonist's attention. The images above seemed somewhat familiar to him. Suddenly, a prompt pops up in the cave. Choose a branch path. Defeat the demon guardian warriors, as well as the magic-controlled demon puppets. Ultimately occupy the Dalmatian High Fortress. It is clear that this level is an assessment of individual strength. Rostana was the first to choose a branch path. Before leaving, she did not forget to greet the protagonist. This made Alice very displeased. It felt like something she liked was being taken away by someone else. Then he chose in a huff. He took another fork in the road. However, before leaving, he did say something to the protagonist. He told him not to fall down without seeing his money. For his grand ambitions, the protagonist certainly would not stop here. But what he didn't know was, outside the castle, someone was plotting a shocking conspiracy. At this moment, the protagonist was walking in the tunnel. Suddenly, he heard a long-lost demon lullaby. When he turned around to look back, he discovered a crowd of dense figures approaching him. Upon closer inspection, he realized that it was the demon's royal guard. At first, the protagonist even thought they were his loyal troops, until he called out to them and they didn't respond. Moreover, they wanted to kill him. It was at this moment that the protagonist finally realized he was still participating in the festival activities. In order to clear the level quickly, the protagonist activated the true eye. To his surprise, he found that these puppets had inexplicably turned into women. This left the protagonist puzzled. Why had it turned out this way? However, regardless of whether they were male or female, the protagonist just needed to defeat them to progress. The other 3 in the team were the same. They only needed to defeat the puppets to clear the level. Soon, the protagonist defeated all the puppets that obstructed him one by one. The door behind him opened as a red lightning bolt struck, successfully opening the door to the second level. This was the St. Guard volcano from the battle years ago, and the one lurking in the shadows also revealed himself. And he was none other than Teacher Aphrodite. With the eruption of the volcano in the second level, the flame demon boss of this level made a grand appearance. But he looked different from before. This made the protagonist fall into deep thought for a moment, and this was specially prepared by the teacher for the protagonist. He not only changed the gender of the puppets, but also deliberately increased their size. However, by doing so, the teacher forgot that the puppets on the other routes would also change accordingly. Alice couldn't help but comment when she saw it. She suspected that the protagonist would also develop such strange chest muscles in the future. Meanwhile, Newt is jealous that the other has a bigger size than him. As for Rostana, there's even less to say. They have started to envy each other's size. Before the protagonist could figure it out, the puppet launched an attack on him. Helplessly, the fire demon flew up. The guardian of St. Guard volcano. You can only continue by stepping over my corpse. You can proceed only then. If you lose, you must kneel before me and surrender. Confess your crimes. I will ravage your body, making you forever submit to me. As soon as these words were spoken, the protagonist felt a trace of a familiar presence. The teacher hiding in the shadows quickly covered their mouth, afraid that continuing would reveal their identity. To avoid arousing the protagonist's suspicion, the teacher immediately controlled the puppet, unleashing the wrath of St. Guard. Several columns of fire shot into the sky, surrounding the protagonist entirely. In this move, the protagonist knew very well. It was a traditional skill of the fire demon clan. Surrounded by intense flames, no creature could survive and escape, unless the opposing magic was powerful enough to withstand the scorching heat. Facing Ristana's wind magic, the flame demon's skill was instantly shattered. He became the first person in the team to pass. However, it wasn't that simple for the protagonist. The flames were continuously burning his body. Just then, the system suddenly displayed a prompt. Do you accept the help of teammate Rostana? For the demon lord protagonist, dealing with a puppet, he naturally would not accept help. Although the flames around him were extremely fierce, the protagonist knew that his endurance wouldn't last long. So the protagonist only needed to use the little magic power he had. to create a defensive barrier, to withstand the burning flames for that duration. At that time, he would be able to launch an attack when the puppet was exhausted. However, just as the protagonist set up the barrier, it was scorched by the flames, creating cracks. It was then that the protagonist realized there was a teacher behind the puppet, continuously providing magical support. The smokescreen not only would not wither over time, but rather expanded even more. It even made bold claims. Do you want to advance? Then kneel and beg me, hero. In the face of the puppet's threat, the protagonist showed no signs of wavering. He even stated that for thousands of years, no one has been able to make him kneel. Seeing that the protagonist refused to back down, the teacher had no choice but to control the puppet to attack again. With a single punch, the ground began to tremble. Dust flew up and smoke rose. Fortunately, the protagonist was agile, narrowly avoiding the blow. However, the protagonist's magic power was nearly depleted now. He couldn't withstand a direct confrontation for long at all. He could only find the magical connection between the puppet and the teacher. Then he activated the true eye, in order to look for the puppet's flaws. As the protagonist had suspected, there was a magical receiving point at the puppet's chest. The moment the puppet launched its attack again, the protagonist leapt forward to her front. With one punch, he shattered the connection between the teacher and the puppet. Without the teacher's magic supply, the puppet instantly lost its power. This battle saw the protagonist achieve another overwhelming victory. Moreover, the protagonist also had a round sphere in his hand, which was continuously releasing magic power. And this magic power was just enough to replenish him. As the magic power continued to deplete, the teacher also detected something unusual. However, the rapid depletion of magic power caused him to feel weak and collapse to the ground. Nevertheless, the teacher eventually severed the connection with the puppet. But the teacher did not give up. He once again controlled the puppet to attack the protagonist. However, the puppet without magic transmission was simply no match in the eyes of the protagonist. A casually charged energy cannon could easily take care of the puppet. At the moment of defeating the puppet, the system popped up a notification. Fiery demon hunt completed. Please return to the entrance selection point. Watching the protagonist pass through again, the teacher decided to step in personally this time to face him. Meanwhile, at the entrance selection point, Alice and her group were discussing the protagonist. They claimed to be afraid he would drag the whole team down. But in reality, they were worried about his safety. At that moment, Rostana stepped out and questioned them. Since you were so worried, why didn't you help him earlier? Facing this question, Alice stubbornly insisted, saying she wasn't worried at all. She only cared about whether she could advance. Little did she know, Rostana told her, that if one member fails, the whole team would be eliminated. At this, the two of them shivered. Later, Rostana said it was a trick. If it weren't for Newt holding Alice, they might have gotten into a fight. During their antics, the protagonist emerged from the tunnel. Seeing that the protagonist was safe and sound, Newt happily hugged the protagonist in the breeze. He even claimed that the two of them would fight for you. After the farce, the system prompted again. It is said that the Demon Lord is debauched and tyrannical. He possesses 108 guardians by his side, focusing on pleasure, and the mistress of Damatian Castle is one of the strongest female guardians among them. The female guardian in this warrior festival will be played by a teacher from the academy. Being described like this by poets, the protagonist began to doubt whether he was truly the Demon Lord. Just then, the castle's corridor doors suddenly all closed. The final boss of this level, the boss slowly descended from above, and she was none other than Lacey, who previously served the protagonist. The moment he saw her, the protagonist was instantly speechless. When did his personal maid become the strongest female guardian? Newt couldn't help but comment upon seeing her. She looked like just a plain and unremarkable female guardian. Little did she know, just after she said that, the fake Lacey suddenly multiplied into countless copies of herself. This made Alice and her companions instantly alert. They remarked that it was true the Demon Lord was debauched and immoral. Now this is great. The protagonist didn't even get a chance to explain. Before the protagonist could come to his senses, the fake Lacey launched an attack, and Newt was equally unyielding. He made a stance and leapt up. Although the enemy had the numerical advantage, it was still a piece of cake for them. With the onslaught of wind magic, the clones were continuously shattered. Only the protagonist was slacking off to the side, silently counting the number of enemies. No matter how they killed the clones, the number of fake Laceys remained unchanged. After fighting for a long time, not a single one was lost. Instead, their magic power gradually dissipated. In order to advance quickly, the protagonist used the Eye of Truth again. In the blink of an eye, his true form was found by the protagonist. However, he had just consumed a large amount of magic power dealing with the fire demon, which left him with insufficient magic power to confront his teacher. However, the protagonist later discovered that there was someone present in his team. Then, in front of them, he voiced his thoughts. As a result, Alice felt a bit shy after hearing it, while Newt began to tease. Although this method was feasible, Alice still had some concerns. After all, the magic power was given to the protagonist. What should they do? At this moment, Rostana suddenly stepped forward and said, "No wonder the one left behind at that time was Arya. The human race only thinks of itself." After hearing this, Newt also realized the implication. Could it be that the two sacred heroes who sacrificed themselves at that time fell because they gave their magic power to Arya? That's why they fell? Faced with Rostana's slander, Alice immediately retorted, "Even so, what does this have to do with being human? Just look at the present. Whether it's the Hero Academy or the entire continent, haven't you humans interfered enough? It's because the one who fought the Demon King in the end is Arya. Now the demon race stands with us on the stage once again. How will the human race choose? This remark instantly plunged Alice into deep thought, and she recalled the opinions that the protagonist had defended for her before. Then she made up her mind to let the protagonist absorb her magic power. Meanwhile, Ristana's conspiracy officially began. The more magic power the protagonist absorbs, the more her magic refining factor matures within her. As the magic power continues to flow, the magic power within them also diminishes. And under the flow of their magic power, the protagonist began to seek the weaknesses of the counterfeit ranch. She had once vowed to serve the protagonist loyally, whether it was seeing her portrait, or the statue of the protagonist. Even seeing a similar shadow would make her kneel in worship. So the protagonist plans to use this weakness to make her kneel involuntarily. Taking advantage of the moment, he launched an attack. Saying this, the protagonist transformed his magic into the body of the demon lord. However, it was completely ineffective. She even laughed at the protagonist. The key was that the naive protagonist still believed that his transformed demon lord wasn't as handsome as before. Meanwhile, the teacher didn't have time to mess around with the protagonist. With a wave of her hand, she launched a whip attack at her.